The week in Queens was supposed to be simple, soft lights in the window, a star saved for the top of the tree, the little rituals that make a home feel like a season unto itself. But simplicity never lasted long in the bunker house. It began with a knock and an entrance that felt like a stage cue, Beverly LaSalle crossing the threshold in a dress that caught the lamplight and turned the living room into a theater. Edith fussed with motherly pride, all nerves and sweetness, while Archie clomped in from the dining room, armed with a knife and fork and an attitude announcing in his usual way that surprise parties and big feelings were things best left to other zip codes. Beverly shrugged off the chill outside with jokes, and a beau teasing about Carnegie Hall, about the art of sitting down in a gown, about making an ordinary apartment feel like a backstage corridor. It was a bright, silly, generous kind of evening, the kind where Edith's hands kept moving, because love is a kinetic language, the kind where even Archie's muttering couldn't puncture the mood. The warmth stuck to Beverly like perfume. She kissed cheeks, laughed at Archie's grousing about who should be invited to Christmas dinner, and called Edith her sister and her brother in the same breath, widening the family vocabulary in a way that embarrassed no one except the one man who always performed embarrassment as a form of authority. Edith kept pressing tokens of real affection into Beverly's hands, the kind of homemade gestures that say more than speeches ever do clippings, notes keepsakes bound together with paste and hope. For a moment, the house felt invincible, like kindness could be a fire. You stoke with casseroles and corny songs like Queens itself had decided to show off its softer edges. Then the door closed behind him, and the night did what nights sometimes do. Mike, who has the heart of an idealist and the body of a man who believes he can still reason with the world, came home shaken and bruised the medical tape on his arm, proof that New York weather isn't the only thing that can turn hard without warning. Two kids with a pipe that was the portrait cheap courage, quick violence, schoolyard meanness sharpened into something lethal. Beverly stepped between the blow and the boy, and whatever glamour she'd brought into the living room earlier became a different kind of light, the ordinary holy clarity of someone who protects another simply because someone must. In the raw fluorescent glare that follows strangers with weapons, a doctor appeared not for updates, but for information next of kin. A name, a phone number, the worst sentence in the world spoken in a tone, invented to make it survivable. It didn't make it survivable. The seasons shifted then. The house lost a color. Even the air seemed cautious, as if laughter were an animal that had to be coaxed back with slow hands. Grief never lands evenly. Archie tried to manage it with the only tools he trusts, words as walls jokes, as barricades rules as flashlights that can be pointed at confusing corners. He talked about normal like it was a security gate you could lock after dark. His compliments came out sideways because tenderness always sounds strange in the mouth of a man who thinks gentleness is a secret weakness. But they came out all the same. Gloria argued and then went quiet the way adult children do when they've said the true thing, and discovered that truth can't pull a nail out of the past. Edith fell into a silence so unfamiliar that even Archie didn't know how to argue with it. When Sunday arrived like a clock that had never lied, she refused church. She didn't renounce faith, she simply couldn't carry this particular sorrow into that particular room. If a church is a place where you bring the unfixable things and set them down, hers felt for the first time like it didn't have a shelf for this one. She sat on the porch and held herself together with the quiet expertise of a woman who has kept generations upright by reminding them where the sugar is and when to let the coffee cool. Or maybe it was simpler than that a friend had died, because cruelty likes the sound of its own echo, and somewhere inside Edith's devotional bones a string had snapped. Life still insisted on its schedule. It always does. A week that began with a hospital corridor had the indecency to move on to knock again to offer a different kind of spotlight. It came disguised as a laundromat stunt. A pitchman known for ripping shirts on television tore Archie's favorite souvenir straight down the middle and waved $50 at the damage. $50. It was a bribe designed to turn outrage into anecdote. Archie tried to convert the moment into dignity and negotiation, using the language of money as if it could repair feeling. But business is a river. Once you're in the current, grabs every ankle. Soon there were lights and a camera and a job with a script. So easy, even an honest person could say it. This half of the shirt was washed in the other brand, this half in Sunny Suds. The only thing the script couldn't account for was Edith. She was born with the reflex that points to the truer side, and pointing at the truer side is a habit that cannot be unlearned once the body decides it will tell the truth for you. The ad man needed the saleable answer. Edith kept giving the correct one. Take after take, she chose the half that deserved to be chosen, which made her useless to the client and beautiful to anyone whose soul still remembers the sound of right and wrong. They wrapped without a commercial, and she left with a modest check and the peace that accompanies doing a small thing properly. Archie grumbled about the opportunity cost in dollars and pride. Edith made dinner and folded laundry and somehow put softness back into the room. If money doesn't solve it, maybe spectacle will. That was Archie's next idea. He staked his hopes on the Super Bowl because America has a way of pouring balm into anything if the game is big enough. He rented a huge screen, ordered heavy glassware that felt like it could keep men honest with their pores, and vented a 2-for-1 special so creative it almost seemed generous, stacked ham chain sandwiches into short edible walls and filled the bar with noise and masculine confidence. There were football squares and small-time dreams, $1,000 in receipts, maybe more, the kind of night a neighborhood man tells himself he's earned just by sheer stubbornness. Halftime brought 2 strangers and a different kind of math. This is a holdup. Nobody moved. The room froze into a shape it didn't like. Wallets came out. Watches came off. And then came the humiliation that would become a story told in embarrassed whispers, the command to drop their pants. It sounds comic at a distance. It wasn't comic there. It was a lesson about how quickly dignity can be confiscated, even by amateurs with cheap pistols and shaky nerves. When it was over, most of the cash was gone, the football pool had evaporated, and Archie was left to inventory his losses, including the ridiculous discovery that in a room of men reduced to their underwear, he believed he had the worst-looking shorts. Edith, steady in the way a witness can be steady for the person she loves, told him his legs were better than he imagined. Another man in the bar wordlessly agreed. A small mercy, but a mercy is a mercy, even if it arrives late and whispers. Families recover by practicing being a family again. After the robbery and the ruined ad and the funeral that wasn't called a funeral in the family room, Aunt Iola arrived like a test of hospitality the universe had mailed to their exact address. She was the sort of relative you can't slot neatly into a calendar. Tidy with her own habits, lively with jokes that blushed the room, carrying a racy paperback that announced without apology that older people not only still live, they live in color. She was meant to catch a bus to Cousin Sydney's, a plan that dissolved on contact with real life. There is always a medical emergency somewhere off stage in a big family. This time it was an appendectomy that canceled her lodging. Another cousin Emily would do eventually. For now, there was no place to go. Archie rattled his sabers about privacy in his own house, about how many queens a castle can handle, about a husband's right to walk around in his drawers. Edith answered with a pineapple. The details seemed random until it wasn't. You can test a pineapple's ripeness by pulling a leaf from its crown. If it yields easily, the fruit is ready. There is always a lesson at the grocery store if you live with the kind of aunt who talks in parables. Somehow the pineapple made the problem manageable. If a guest leaves your house a little sweeter than she arrived, maybe you were ripe enough to host her after all. It would be easy to downgrade all of this to situational comedy, a living room turned stage, an argument about who should sit down to Christmas dinner, a Santa suit a father didn't want to try on for his grandson, a detergent test that became an ethics exam, a halftime heist with humiliating choreography, a house guest who threatened the ecosystem of a man's recliner. But to live in these rooms, even for the length of a week, is to understand that each scene is an honesty test. Who are we when someone we love becomes a target for someone else's boredom and hate? Who are we when money waves its hand and asks us to say the easy thing on camera? Who are we when men with guns make the whole room absurd? Who are we when a relative needs a bed on short notice, and the bed is technically already occupied by the illusion of our privacy? The answers don't arrive as speeches. They arrive as gestures, small and cumulative. Edith invites the person who would otherwise be alone. She keeps a scrapbook because to remember someone is the most practical form of love. She points to the right half of the shirt even when it costs money. She pours coffee, forgets the sugar, remembers the sugar, starts again. She declines church not because she has stopped believing in God, but because the God she believes in has to be the God who knew Beverly by name. And in the new geometry of her grief, the pews line up wrong. Archie changes, but only in the way stubborn men do sideways, like a car easing into a tight parking space it swore it couldn't fit. He calls things by the names that make him feel safest and then does the kinder thing anyway. He puts on the Santa suit for Joey after vowing he wouldn't. He protects his bar by trying to turn it into an event, and then protects his dignity by putting the bar back together after it is stripped of cash and swagger. He argues about what is normal until the word begins to wobble in his mouth and makes room for a compliment that would have embarrassed him a year ago. He offers to take Aunt Iola back if the promised plan falls through, and when it doesn't fall through, he is almost disappointed that he won't get credit for the offer he finally meant. Gloria and Mike hover at the moral edge of things idealists learning with a little shock that ideals are louder in a living room than in the parking lot where a pipe is swinging. Mike carries the soft guilt of a person whose life was saved by someone who should not have had to save it. Gloria stands in the doorway of every scene like a witness for the prosecution, and the defense furious at cruelty and tender toward the witnesses it leaves behind. Their marriage bumps across the week's obstacles and keeps moving proof that partnership is less about synchronized opinions than about synchronized returns to the table. If there is one image that refuses to fade, it is the porch at the hour when church bells ring. Edith sits in her Sunday dress and says she can't go. Somewhere behind her in the house, the Santa suit is hanging where someone will find it and put it on for a child. On the coffee table is the torn shirt from a commercial that never aired. In a drawer are the smaller change from the bar, the dollars that weren't taking the spare key that always seems to survive a break-in. And under the tree, maybe this is the important part, there is a space where a gift would have gone if gifts could be the sort of thing that replaces a person. They can't. So the space remains and the family learns to walk around it without pretending it isn't there. What these days teach in their messy human way is not that life is unfair. The adults already knew that. But that love is a skill, not a move. It's the skill Edith practices when she points to the honest half of the shirt under lights. The skill Archie tries on every time he says no, and then finds his way to yes. And the skill Mike practices when he stops making speeches and takes the casserole out of the oven without being asked. The skill Gloria demonstrates when she turns righteous anger into practical comfort. A week like this does not resolve. It breathes. It changes shape every time someone opens a door or a mouth. What remains are small sentences the house knows by heart. Sit down, have some coffee, tell me what happened, I'll go with you, I'll be right here, I'm sorry. In a world interested in applause and tidy edits, those small sentences are not a finale. They are how people keep one another alive. The porch did not hold Edith forever. Sorrow never asked permission, but it also never refuses company for long. It followed her back into the kitchen where she did the ordinary work with deliberate hands, the gentle bully of routine, making its case that people can be mended by small obediences. She wiped the counter even when it was clean, set the cups before the coffee had finished percolating, laid out 2 spoons for sugar, though she knew Archie would complain that it sweetened the coffee past the legal limit. The house breathed with her. When Archie shuffled in the argument waiting on his tongue, she looked up as if his words were a draft under the door and gently pushed it shut. He still talked because that is what he does when he does not know how to apologize, but the sentences came softer, their corners sanded down by the week. He told her the Santa suit fit after all. He told her Joey had laughed like a bell. He told her it mattered to him that she saw him put the suit on, even if he pretended it didn't. It was as close to a confession as he got, that the world felt less cruel when a little boy believed in something jolly and red and absurd. What he could not say, Edith knew anyway. She knew that grief can make a person mean in the mornings and policy-minded in the afternoons and weirdly sentimental before bed. She understood that the argument about Normal was a sandbag he stacked against a flood he could no longer name. So she let him talk about cereal prices and the scandal of the city's sanitation routes and whether the cable man was cheating the whole borough, and she didn't push the conversation toward the hospital or the way the doctor's voice had made the room smaller. Instead, she waited for the invisible threshold every couple reaches in a painful week. The moment when a practical chore admits it is an embrace. She touched his wrist when he reached for the coffee. He didn't move his hand away. The neighborhood noticed they're quiet. Friends and strangers have their own brand of kindness. When tragedy strikes, some bring casseroles that don't reheat well. Some deliver theories no one asked for some, arrive with a joke that overshoots its landing, and still somehow makes the room lighter. The postman made a point of thumping the lid of their mailbox like a good luck charm. Mrs. Canby across the hall pretended she needed to borrow sugar and left with a bag of groceries Edith wouldn't have let her buy. Even the butcher down the block cut the roast a little thinner and called it custom trimming for the lady, with a heart bigger than the burro. New York can be blunt as a curb and tender as a coat thrown over a stranger in the rain, sometimes on the same corner. The bonkers got both kinds, and the mix suited them. Mike carried his own weight awkwardly, as if his body was a jacket he didn't know how to wear anymore. Survivor's guilt is an odd tailor. It pulls at seams no one sees. He tried chores as penance, trash out early dishes, dried before the rack could drip errands, run without commentary, and yet none of it landed as enough. At night, he whispered to Gloria that he would have preferred a scar, something visible that could stand in the doorway and admit what had happened. Gloria made space for his sentences and also cleaned around them because someone had to. She was less interested in the symmetry of justice than in the physics of care. Put a plate of food under a hungry person's nose, and their grief will at least have to move out of the way long enough to smell it. She set down plates. She left the sink to soak. She pressed her forehead to his for a count of 10, a ritual that replaced language when language refused to cooperate. When the detergent people called the house and asked whether Edith might be willing to try again in a week with a slightly different script, Archie snapped that his wife wasn't a jukebox. You don't put in a coin and get the song that's convenient for your party. Then he lowered his voice and asked how much. The answer wasn't enough to soothe pride or pay for a new roof on the bar. Edith solved it the only way that allowed everyone to save face. She thanked the man on the phone for thinking of her, and then explained gently that she had promised herself never to point at the wrong thing if a camera was running. The man on the other end of the line was quiet for a second. The kind of quiet that suggests an interior vote was taken, and the results will be reported to a boss who won't like them. "You're a good woman, Mrs. Bunker," he said, and hung up. Archie muttered that being a good woman rarely pays scale, but the mutter had no teeth. In the ledger Edith kept in her head, truth had already been tallied on the right side of the page. At the bar, Archie tried to put dignity back on the shelf where it belonged. He replaced the glassware, patched the hole in the ceiling with a square of plaster that dried a different shade, and declared that going forward, the only halftime allowed in his establishment would involve sandwiches, not sidearms. His regulars drifted back like fish after a boat cuts its motor. A few were sheepish in a way men get when they've been revealed as mortal. A few made big speeches about how they would have acted if they'd had one more beer in them. The football pool was revived in miniature for a next game, though the romance of a basketball square is weaker than a Super Bowl square, and everyone knows it. Still, coins clinked and men laughed, and a kind of normal rolled back over the floorboards. Archie put a fresh sign in the window advertising 2 for 1, ask your bartender for details. And the details were exactly as slippery as before, which is to say familiar enough to be comforting. Aunt Iola installed temporarily in the spare room that isn't quite a room got along with the apartment better than anyone expected. She woke early, made her bed so flat you could bounce a quarter and slip quietly around the morning rush like an expert commuter. She did not meddle, which is the first law of being a successful house guest, but she did deploy her repertoire in careful doses, a funny line over coffee that made Edith snort into her cup, a sly allusion to the title of her book that made Archie blush and Gloria howl, a midday anecdote about lost and found spectacles that ended with a moral tidy enough to be folded and stored in a drawer. She offered to pay for groceries. Edith refused with a look that translated in their shared family dialect to "your money is no good here, as long as you keep turning the pillowcases right side out before they go in the wash." They were an excellent pair. These two women, one with a talent for quiet industry, the other with a knack for making a task look like a waltz. The day finally came when the call arrived. Cousin Emily's return flight had landed, the guest room was ready, and the taxi was idling outside. Archie affected disappointment and relief in equal measures, a face that said at once, "You are a handful, and I might miss your hands." Iola checked the room once more to ensure she left it better than she found. It kissed Edith on both cheeks, told Mike to loosen his necktie on ordinary days just to practice being happy, and told Gloria that the best marriages are built from two people who can make a joke out of the same bruise. When she turned to Archie, she took his hand, which surprised him into stillness. "You're a good man when you aren't trying so hard to be right," she said, and then, because she could not resist, and because life is short, added a pineapple tip that made him bark out a laugh despite himself. The hall swallowed her footsteps. The apartment felt bigger and smaller at the same time, the way rooms do after a beloved guest leaves. Around then, an invitation arrived from the church. It was not addressed only to Edith. The pastor had enough sense to write "Dear Bunker Family," but its true recipient stood reading it in the kitchen until the edges curled slightly in her hands. A remembrance service would be held, a quiet one with candles and a hymn that had no business breaking anyone's heart and would certainly break everyone's. Edith did not commit on paper. She laid the letter on the table and walked to the window. The city was doing the ordinary work of late afternoon trucks, groaning children, yelling a dog somewhere, negotiating a grievance with a pigeon. Archie came in, saw the letter, sat down, picked it up, put it down. He didn't offer advice, which was the precise help she needed. It is easier to choose a hard thing when no one is pushing your back. After dinner, she folded the invitation once, then again, and tucked it into her purse, the place where important things live until their hour arrives. When the evening of the service came, Edith dressed in something she called simple, and which looked to anyone not raised in her generation like a piece of formal wear for a meeting with an angel. Archie fastened the clasp at her neck with fingers that had never been praised for their delicacy, and then cleared his throat as if to claim credit for the sky. They walked without speaking. Queens at that hour can feel like a chapel if you let it. The streetlights kneel, pigeons fall quiet, and the elevated train delivers a homily on endurance. Inside the church, the air smelled like wood and wax and effort. The pastor did not grandstand. He read a short passage about kindness chased out of town and then left a silence wide enough for everyone to lay their particular grief inside it. Edith's hands were steady. When it came time for the candle, she struck the match with the care of a woman who has lit 1,000,000 stoves and still believes in the small miracle of flame. And in the moment the wick caught, her faith did not so much return as remember how to sit in a room with her sorrow and not be embarrassed by it. She did not march to the rail. She did not announce a doctrine updated for the tragedy at hand. She simply stood there, eyes bright, and let the light declare whatever it could declare. On the walk home, Archie didn't ask if she felt better. He asked if she wanted ice cream. She said yes. Some reconciliations deserve to be celebrated with a scoop. In quieter hours, the house recovered its odd normal. Joey toddled after Archie's shadow with a devotion that made the old man stand a little straighter. Gloria tried a new recipe that left the kitchen smelling like somebody else's vacation. Mike washed the pot so she wouldn't have to pretend the experiment had been a success. The neighbors returned to talking about trash pickup in public schools and who had planted the petunias that somehow survived February. Life resumed the way it always does, by pretending it had never paused. Yet in the corners of the rooms, the arm of the couch where Beverly had laughed, the spot by the sink where Edith placed the scrapbook before wrapping it in tissue, the closet where the Santa suit waited for its next appointment, something durable had been added. It wasn't wisdom, not exactly. It was the knowledge that a week can hold too much, and people can still hold one another. Even Archie, who preferred his epiphanies, delivered his punchlines, changed in motions too small to advertise. When a man in the bar made a cheap crack at the expense of a stranger's clothes, he lifted an eyebrow that functioned as a warning. When a customer tried to argue the price of a double by calling it creative math, he told him the creativity was in the sign, not the glass, and poured without the old flourish that dared a man to complain. When a hardware store clerk spoke gently to a woman who did not have enough English for the transaction she needed, he stood to the side and let his heart choose the face it would wear in a moment like that. Later, he would tell Edith some story about nuts and bolts and the disappearance of craftsmanship in the modern age. She would nod and pass him the salt. They were fluent in the language that allows a man to save face while his face is learning to be different. If a stranger had visited the bunkers a month later, they would have found a family midlife as usual, bills stacked with preventive optimism near the phone, a supermarket flyer folded to the page with the bargains a laundry basket, making its daily tour between sofa and bedroom and back again. They might have heard about the night the bar was robbed, or the day the ad didn't happen told now in tones that made room for laughter. They might have noticed a pineapple ripening on the counter and smiled at the private joke. They would almost certainly have left with the impression that the house was ordinary. And they would have been right in the way people are, right when they look at the ocean and say it is water. But if they had stayed long enough to watch Edith carry the scrapbook from its drawer and dust it long enough to hear the way Archie's voice changed when he said friend, and meant it long enough to catch the look Gloria gave Mike when he reached for her hand, without any preface they might have guessed at the extra ingredient. Ordinary is not a synonym for easy. Ordinary is the honorific given to a life that keeps going. On a weekday, when nothing special was scheduled, Edith met Beverly again in the odd theater of memory. The closing of a cupboard, the clink of a plate, the echo of a joke landing in a room that had learned to laugh responsibly. It wasn't a haunting, it was a visit. In that visit, the house felt briefly like it had the correct population. She let the feeling stand as long as it wanted to, and then because the timer on the oven rang, and because people must eat, even on days when the dead feel particularly present, she turned and pulled out a pan of rolls. The air changed the way air changes when bread enters it. She buttered the tops with a tenderness she would have denied was symbolic. And when Archie walked in, sniffed the air and said, without quite knowing why, now that's what I call a miracle, she did not correct him. She put a roll in his hand. He took a bite and closed his eyes as if re-entering a favorite room. If a story must have a moral, let it be this one: unadorned and outdoorsy families do not recover from weeks like these. They learn to live on land that has shifted. They treasure the straightforward kindnesses because they cannot afford to waste the fancy kind. They point to the honest half of the shirt even when no one is filming. They lock the cash drawer and invite the regulars back anyway. They say yes to a borrowed bed and then keep a space in their cupboard for whatever lesson arrived with a suitcase. They light a candle, not because it defeats the darkness, but because it teaches the room how to see again. And they keep a Santa suit in the closet as if joy is something you can summon with a costume, because sometimes it is.